Thank you very much, Patrick. So I'd like to start, before I start the sort of official part, I'd like to really express my admiration and appreciation for all the work that was done by the organizing team for the SEFI conference. And they've been working on it for 2 years. They put tremendous effort into it, and I think we can all agree that it's been a resounding success. And I'm very impressed and really delighted that this took place at EPFL. So, dear SEFI participants, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here today to introduce the final keynote speaker of this conference, whose theme is of vital importance for education at institutions like EPFL. This week's presentations, panel discussions, and workshops have provided ample opportunities to think deeply about the kind of engineering education we want to offer our students, to best prepare them to thrive and contribute to society in a rapidly and profoundly changing world. As I'm sure you've realized over the course of the week, the education we offer our students is a subject of considerable ongoing reflection and discussion at EPFL. We strongly believe that the EPFL should train engineers and scientists who are not only technically excellent, but also responsible citizens, guided by ethics, integrity, and empathy. Major societal challenges are significant drivers of motivation for our students. They seek to infuse their studies and plans for the future career with meaning and purpose. Just as sustainability is increasingly integrated into the EPFL curriculum, we should consider students' desire to make a difference when designing our curricula. We should include more courses at the interface of technology and societal challenges and provide opportunities to acquire vital transversal skills, especially when integrated into the technical curriculum to provide appropriate context, while not adding to the already very heavy course load. For example, we could do so through the natural framework of project-based learning, and we can do it even more. It is also essential, vital, that engineering education be inclusive. All potential students should feel welcome, regardless of their gender, socioeconomic background, sexual orientation, or other extra-academic factor. Encouraging diversity in the student population and ensuring that each student feel a deep sense of belonging to and support from our community are vital tasks for faculty and staff at engineering institutions. This morning's keynote speaker, Dr. Donna Riley, who is the Jim and Ellen King Dean of Engineering Education at the University of New Mexico, is an internationally renowned thought leader on diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering education. She has broad experience in engineering education and research, having obtained her PhD in engineering and public policy at CMU, and then held a range of academic and governmental positions, including as professor of engineering at Smith College, program director in engineering education at the National Science Foundation, and head of the engineering school at Purdue University. She is also a fellow of the American Society of Engineering Education. Dr. Riley has written extensively on the integration of ethics, communication, social analysis, lifelong learning, and other essential skills into engineering education, and on the ways that engineering intersects with science and technology studies. In particular, she's written 2 books, Engineering and Social Justice, and Engineering Thermodynamics and 21st Century Energy Problems, which engage with and explore these ideas. This morning, Dr. Riley will speak to us about engaging moral imagination in engineering ethics education, about the need for deeper engineering ethics to actively engage public values in professional life. I look forward greatly to her lecture on this very important subject and welcome her warmly to the stage.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that introduction. Bonjour, guten Morgen, buenos dias, good morning. Thank you for the welcome that I received at SEFI this week. This is my first SEFI conference. I've been around a while, but this is the first time I've actually been here, and it's truly an honor to be presenting here as Keynote and to have been here with you all week and learning so much from you all. I swear I wrote the talk before the meeting. You'll see a lot of resonances with the prior keynotes, and I think that's just a really great sign of of this community and kind of how we're thinking and working together. So I want to begin with a personal story about my former car. In late 2010, I was looking for a new car. My previous car had had an accident. And I was trying to do the right thing environmentally, and I considered my transportation needs and habits, and I determined that the most environmentally conscious purchase I could make at that time was a high-efficiency green diesel. Volkswagen had been taken out of the American diesel market because of emissions and was coming back because they said they had solved their diesel emission problems. So I named my car Rudy after Rudolf Diesel. And then just a few years later, I learned that I had instead been part of the problem. And I had been contributing to some 10,000 excess deaths worldwide from the nitrogen oxide emissions from Volkswagen's diesel cheat. And the cheat is perhaps an example of engineering ingenuity at its worst. Rather than a holistic creativity that finds a third-way solution that advances sustainability, what we saw was a cynical way forward that negatively impacted air quality and public health around the world. But Volkswagen got their diesels back on the US market. So we learned that despite Ferdinand Piech's contribution to a Machiavellian culture at VW, similar tactics were actually deployed in many other automobile companies, notably BMW and Fiat Chrysler. And that indicates a broader problem in the automotive industry. This wasn't just a Volkswagen problem. But in a revealing interview with National Public Radio in the United States, then Volkswagen CEO and computer engineer Matthias Müller explained that engineers solved the problem with creative software solutions, and he couldn't understand why the American people would feel that it was an ethical problem. Some have described James Lang, one of the German engineers who ultimately went to jail for his actions at VW, as too loyal to his employer. And loyalty is, of course, one of the core values that our engineering ethics codes and classes teach. Was James Lang doing as he was taught? The Volkswagen engineers clearly had incredible technical imagination, but I maintain that they lacked moral imagination. There are a variety of definitions of moral imagination out there. Some are more specific than others. Mark Johnson, for example, is very narrowly focused on how imagination is applied in generating options in moral decision-making. Others, like Minette Drumright and Patrick Murphy, think of it in a broader sense of generating creative third-way solutions. And today, I hope you give me license, I'm going to use the term in both of these senses and stretch it maybe a little further to incorporate other uses of creativity in the moral sphere. And ultimately, Rudy's fate was that he was sold back to the Volkswagen Corporation and sat on a huge lot somewhere in California for many years and was eventually resold to some other consumer, purportedly with a fix that controlled the NOx emissions. I don't know if I believe that, honestly. And this is the thing, is that while I knew it intellectually before, I now understand it differently as a swindled consumer. And what I know is that it takes a holistic perspective to engineer. That the legal, the political, the social, the cultural, the global, communication, lifelong learning, sustainability is all engineering, and it can't be relegated through a number of false binaries to context or impact or breadth or professional skills. It is all simultaneously technical and social and professional and political. And we can observe the same of engineers involved in, for example, the Boeing 737 MAX 8 scandal, or the Theranos biotech startup. For those who may not be familiar with Theranos, this was a Silicon Valley startup that produced a kind of vaporware that was set to, it promised to revolutionize medical diagnosis. So it had a real biological impact. And this vaporware created both misdiagnoses and missed diagnoses and harmed a lot of people. And its founder was a chemical engineering dropout who said she didn't think she needed any more classes to do what she wanted to do. And I have to wonder if one of those classes might have been an ethics class. All of these scandals involved software in a kind of a cheat or a cover that sort of elided lapses in regulatory standards or quality regulations or simply ethics. And in all cases, an unfettered market overrode the values of the engineering profession with decisions that were ultimately driven by quarterly profits and greed. So when we look to the future and consider the direction of technology in society, the complexity and integrative nature of future socio-technical problems demand a much more holistic approach to ethical reasoning and emotional intelligence. At ASEE's 125th anniversary distinguished panel in 2018, then incoming ASEE president Stephanie Adams, who's sitting over here, spoke to us of social mess problems that engineers and society face now and in the future. So social messes are one of the categorizations that go beyond wicked problems, right, or complex problems. And Horn and Weber have characterized these as the social mess. And I prefer to call it the socio-technical mess because the technology never seems to be outside of this mess. And these problems are characterized as highly complex, they're poorly defined, they're highly uncertain, they're riddled with ideology, values conflicts, and people can't even agree on what the facts are. And as we heard, these aren't necessarily anything new. We heard that in the keynote yesterday. But some of the recent examples include the global pandemic we've been through, the emergence of AI and other kinds of automation, and climate change. And so given these realities, what should engineering educators be doing to prepare the workforce of the future? And how can engineers enter into values-laden conversations in a way that they can recognize, represent, uphold, and sustain both core public values and the professional values that engineers hold, including but not limited to health, safety, well-being, trust, quality, integrity? And we might ask, how can we prepare engineers for a future in which many of our own jobs can be automated? How can we prepare engineers to envision a socially just future in the face of climate change? Or what other kinds of futures might we imagine for ourselves? One in which everyone is afforded leisure time or a higher quality of life? Or if left to the market's own devices, we may end up with one where a very few benefit and many others are forced into poverty and indignity. So what would engineers need to learn now and know now and do now to create a socially just future? So the heart of my argument here is that as we take stock of the engineering ethics education regime that we currently inhabit, we have a long way to go to develop these kinds of capabilities that we might desire for our students, and I dare say that we might desire to develop for ourselves. Our current engineering ethics regime focuses primarily and substantially on codes, on oaths and ceremonies that have been a central topic of our conversations the last few days, and accreditation and case analysis. And so today I'm going to discuss each of these in turn with a particular focus on their limitations. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not arguing that we simply do away with any of these elements, but I think we need to shift our emphasis away from each of them to move beyond them toward a broader and more holistic conceptualization of engineering ethics education. So to start with codes of ethics, which is sort of my comfort zone as a US person, I'd like to talk about not just the codes, but the processes by which codes are developed, established, and modified, because they reveal much about how institutional power shapes engineering ethics. Ethics codes came into being in the early 20th century in response to several bridge collapses and pressure vessel failures. And I've shown a picture of one from the UK, but there were many in the United States, but nobody snapped a photo at the time. So ultimately, the codes are notable for their political import. The leadership of the professional societies that established codes at this time in electrical, civil, and mechanical engineering all felt that the codes would establish engineering as a true profession, with clout akin to medicine or to law. And it was felt that engineers must have codes of ethics to self-regulate and self-govern professional behavior. If we hadn't done so, it would have been foisted upon us by an outside entity. So it was, in short, a power move. And as engineering historian Amy Slayton has pointed out, such a move is also a boundary drawing exercise. It holds one group accountable for ethical behavior, deeming them expert or worthy to uphold certain standards, and created a class of people separate from the rest. And I want to provide some illustration of how codes reflect that institutional power and how that can limit us as we seek to be better engineers. So my first example dates from 1990, which I note is the same time as the Archimedes Oath was first written. And in 1990, the IEEE, that is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, developed an ethics code where they notably reworded the commonly accepted language in US engineering codes around public paramountcy, that is, that engineers shall hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And they made this change in order to avoid offending the defense industry. So rather than conforming to most of these codes, they adopted language that said the IEEE would accept responsibility in making decisions consistent with the safety, health, and welfare of the public, and to disclose promptly factors that might endanger the public or the environment. So this code reflects what Joe Herkert has called an interested consensus that was reached in the society at that time. And similarly, in 2011, the ASEE Ethics Division was asked by the board of directors of ASEE to draft an ethics code for the organization. And at that time, some people were concerned that petroleum engineers within the society wouldn't like language that would, quote, encourage students to comply with the principles of sustainable development. Now, this is especially curious because ASEE had already endorsed sustainable development in a statement in 1999. But instead, the board adopted language that we should, quote, encourage students to be aware of the environmental and social impact of their solutions. So this is clearly weaker language. Now, note that this is not reflecting a different commitment of the ASEE board to more value-neutral language. Instead, it was the result of the process that produced this interested consensus. That is what the politically charged negotiations around the language ultimately bore. And as a third example, the American Society of Civil Engineers in 2017 established the first additional canon that it had seen in the nearly 100 years of having an ethics code, which was known as Canon 8, and you see the text of it here in green. It formalized and extended commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as community involvement and empowerment that would be essential to enact environmental justice. This interested consensus was dismantled within 3 years of it getting board approval, when a new leader of the organization ordered a total overhaul of the code, ultimately weakening both the diversity language and the community involvement language in its new revamped code. In my previous work, my colleagues, including Jana Lambrinidou and Andrew Katz, have asked what it might mean to create shadow codes, ethics planks that live outside these canonical articulations of engineering ethics, that catalog attempts to reframe priorities or introduce new ones, and that create alternate channels to those that presently create or uphold an interested consensus. And I want to note that adoption of any particular plank is not the point of having these shadow codes. Rather, the point is to reveal and challenge how institutional power shapes engineering ethics via the codes. So this would create an opportunity to widen the circle of moral agents who have the power to shape or at least contest the code. We see professional societies in other disciplines debating, for example, pharmacists and ethicists pharmacists and architects' participation in the death penalty, or psychologists and psychiatrists' use of expertise in prisoner torture. When would engineers stipulate that the right thing to do might actually be to not engineer in a given circumstance? For example, what would it mean for civil engineers to take a professional stance on participation in water privatization? Could engineers place restrictions on our participation of development of particular technologies that we deem harmful to humanity or to the planet? The fact is, the differences already exist within our engineering community and various engineering professional societies. The key is to create a channel that keeps consensus moving. Open dissent can be healthy and productive. As a thought experiment, Jana Lambrinidou and I borrowed the social workers' code of ethics and replaced the word social worker with engineer, just to see what it might reveal about what's missing in engineering ethics codes. It generated some interesting possible addition to our engineering ethics codes, as you can see here. Of course, following through on these commitments would require some significant structural change in the profession. Adding to the canon or challenging it, I think, is all very productive, because engineers of the future can study how different engineers in different times and places express their understanding of our obligations, and in turn more deeply understand their own obligations in their time and place in some years hence. So I want to turn now to a related conversation around engineering oaths and obligations and induction ceremonies that we've been sort of talking about a bit. So around the same time that the US engineering professional societies were developing codes of ethics, members in the Canadian engineering community were responding to the 1907 Quebec Bridge collapse by developing the ritual of the calling of an engineer, which is known to most as the Iron Ring ceremony. In 1922, Professor A.T.T. Haultain of the University of Toronto gave a talk, interestingly, on the romance of engineering, in which he called for the development of a tribal spirit, which is dated, problematic, but perhaps revealing language among engineers. And after his talk, he gathered with 7 past presidents of the Engineering Institute of Canada and expressed his wish for an oath, like physicians take, to solemnize engineers' commitment to ethical action. And some months later, Haultain decided to approach UK author and Nobel laureate Rudyard Kipling to write the ceremonial language. And it is perhaps not surprising that in this time period, engineers would be enamored of the author of the poem The White Man's Burden, extolling the virtues of colonialism. But it is important to note that Kipling's racist views were outside the norm even for his time. And while little of the ceremony language is readily available even to this day, many have critiqued over the years its sexist, racist, colonialist, and overtly Christian language. Some have noted that it takes a very narrow approach to ethics focused on shoddy workmanship rather than a broader acknowledgement of engineering in a context or noting responsibility that engineers might have to communities. And as a side note, US engineers eventually copied the Canadians and developed their own ring ceremony in 1970. It also carries sexist, racist, and overtly religious language, including Christian prayer, relying on the need for divine guidance in engineering work. It also carries nationalistic sentiments, concluding with the very presidential, "God bless you and may God bless America." While some universities in the US, including mine, have quietly altered the ceremony text to avoid sexist, racist, nationalistic, and religious language, the official template remains unchanged. In 2022, a group of anti-colonial and feminist Canadian scholars, you may recognize one of them because she is here in this room, began a campaign known as Retool the Ring. It has gained broad support from individuals and organizations across Canada, and the 7 wardens, which is the very antiquated name of the organization in charge of the ceremony, the 7 wardens have agreed to revise the ceremony. Some in Retool the Ring have explicitly asked for a recognition of the harm the ceremony has caused over the past century. However, as with the codes, this process will be subject to an interested consensus. And it is therefore likely, in my opinion, that the changes will not ultimately satisfy the ceremony's critics. Despite Robin May Paul's, where are you, Robin? Robin is here. Despite Robin's explicit warning that removing a few religious references and adding some she pronouns is not enough, if the problem is understood merely as a call to make the ceremony more inclusive of women or of First Nations people, they will be solving the wrong problem. So at this point, you may be wondering, what about Europe? I'm a North American. I'm talking about North America the whole time. Well, Christelle Didier and Bertrand Hériard-Dubrulle have described the history of ethics of engineering ethics in Europe, noting that the development of codes, creeds, and oaths occurred a good bit later here than in North America. And perhaps as a result, European codes tend to deal more holistically with questions of engineering and society, and can more readily incorporate scholarship from science and technology studies, as well as more ably respond to emerging technologies. And as a longtime admirer of the precautionary principle, I have long wondered about its adoption in the EU when North Americans have been not interested in going there. And I wonder if perhaps the holistic nature of engineering ethics codes here and the implementation of the precautionary principle might be interrelated in some way or reflect a similar underlying interested consensus. In our particular historical moment, I think I would be remiss not to mention the 1950 Association of German Engineers Creed, which is notable in its explicit call to resistance. And I'm quoting here, "The engineer does not bow to those who disregard human rights and abuse the essence of technology." This is highly unusual for engineering ethics codes or oaths or creeds. This one is, you could translate it as confession, but I like creed better. I don't know, someone who speaks German better than I do can help me with that. But I'm using creed here as my translation. But this was a statement they made in 1950 in the wake of the Holocaust, so of course it reflects that historical context. But when you consider that historical context, I also think the statement is relatively muted when one considers the role that engineers played in facilitating the atrocities of the Holocaust. So despite the deep involvement, and I will say US engineers at IBM in particular were quite involved, the punch cards came from IBM, right, in facilitating the Holocaust. The US codes did not change much at all after World War II. And instead, perhaps we point to the Nuremberg Code, but that does not acknowledge engineers' specific role, if at all, right? So all of these statements fail to formally take responsibility. And so following the Iron Ring critique, we might point out that we, as engineers, have never really engaged in an explicit acknowledgement of the harm that engineers have caused. So the section quoted here also raises questions about the positioning of human rights. So human rights are critiqued by some as an Enlightenment concept. It's Western, it's individualistic, and this has some bearing on the Archimedean oath conversation. And I would also ask whether the refusal to abuse the essence of technology might presume that technology is inherently good or at least neutral when not being misused, which is something I think many science and technology studies scholars would question. The document also, of course, contains the dated language of its time that we would want to revise today. I don't believe that the statement has been revisited from what I could tell, but I do think a revision or a new statement in the current context of the recent rise in authoritarianism and racist extremism around the world might be in order. But more important than oath or creed loyalty is developing a facility with the range of oaths, the context of the oaths, and a critical analysis of what is missing. Oaths serve similar purposes to codes, and on their surface, the intent is to produce ethical behavior, at least along the lines of an interested consensus, right? But ultimately, they too serve a boundary drawing purpose. They set engineers apart from others with a privileged role, with privileged expertise, and as Amy Slayton would say, they project a desired future in which the profession's optimism is confirmed. So to turn to the Archimedean oath now in this context, I think revising it can be seen as an exercise in moral imagination. Understanding it in relation to the iron ring obligation language or the US engineering ethics codes can also provide some insight into the differences between engineering ethics regimes on different continents and implicitly offer a needed critique of other existing codes and oaths. So for example, the Archimedean oath furthers the notion of an aspirational good, which is something that's missing from many US-based codes of ethics. It speaks of context and consequences in ways that the iron ring obligation does not. It promotes justice and equity as core engineering principles, and it speaks of care. It was written by students rather than engineering society presidents or highly positioned people of other kinds, and it gives some acknowledgement that there are those outside of engineering who might be included as potential participants. At the same time, we might pose some critical questions of the oath as written. For example, the referencing of the UN Declaration of Human Rights as the anchor for some discussion of upholding human rights and environmental sanctity. It continues to be critiqued for Western normative bias and its rooting in individualism, which I think came up yesterday in discussing the Archimedean oath. So we might ask how the oath could go further to incorporate global South or non-Western perspectives beyond what the UN positioning affords. Or how can the oath avoid reinforcing a generic social value, or what Gary Downey has called normative holism, the idea that engineering is for the good of all people because engineers serve humanity, therefore engineering must be good. Is being careful with military uses sufficient? Or is this the product of an interested consensus? And as a side note, was Archimedes sufficiently careful in his military designs? Because that claw doesn't look very careful to me. So I wonder if, in fact, an engineering ethics oath ought to bear his name. In calls to justice, who decides what is just? Should it really be what I deem to be just, or could those experiencing injustice be positioned or empowered as arbiters of what is just? And why should non-professionals subscribe to an oath written by and for engineers? Who else could have been involved in the writing or could yet be involved in the writing? Perhaps students from other universities, perhaps community members. So we would be wise to remember ultimately that codes and oaths and ceremonies do not, in and of themselves, produce ethical engineers. In some cases, the documents themselves do not stand the test of time, and seem to reinforce unjust power relations of colonialism, sexism, and racism. In essence, one might consider the very documents and their enactments in the induction ceremonies unethical in certain respects today. It is not possible to write an oath for all time, so how can one use an oath to keep the consensus moving? I think the revision process we're considering here for the Archimedean oath is potentially one way to do just that. So this brings me to accreditation processes. I was very surprised when some months ago, Shannon Chance invited me to contribute with co-authors Deanna Martin and Jill Senyuk-Chichek and Robin May Paul to the Routledge International Handbook of Engineering Ethics Education on the topic of accreditation. I learned there was to be an entire section of the book on accreditation, which gave me pause, honestly. I viewed and continue to view accreditation as extremely limited and limiting in its power to produce ethical engineers. Accreditation, especially as enacted by ABET, which is the regime I live under, but I think it is true in other accreditation regimes, that these systems are methods of quality assurance. And they guarantee some bar below which programs may not go. However, I know from my experience with ABET accredited programs that the bar is set very low for ethics education. Guaranteeing a bare minimum is very far from where we want to be. So as we write in our chapter, the accreditation regime is limited in other ways too. Conceptually, it rests on weird normativity. By weird, we mean Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. The power relations of accreditation privilege positivist and reductive ways of knowing and marginalize other perspectives, perpetuating a technical social dualism and systematically elevating the technical. In the 2015 ABET revisions, soft learning outcomes were relegated unaccessible despite so much literature in engineering education demonstrating otherwise. This focus on the technical, according to Aaron Seck, produces a culture of disengagement that undermines engineering ethics education. Ethics education becomes decoupled from moral action and from broader concepts like equity and social justice. The move in the 1990s that brought engineering ethics into the required set of learning outcomes in ABET accreditation, which was then known as Engineering Criteria 2000 or EC 2000, was in fact the same move that brought us into an outcomes-based regime. And this was part of a broader trend in education worldwide, but the implications for engineering ethics education are profound. As Gert Biesta concisely critiqued outcomes-based learning in 2007, we know that asking what works ultimately doesn't work. He calls on us to instead focus on what students ought to learn, and that ought indicates that we are being called to a moral track where process matters, not just outcomes, relationships matter, reflection matters, participation matters, and liberation matters. So in the end, we argue in our handbook chapter that accreditation processes and our participation in them ultimately produces a hollow rhetorical justification for engineering ethics. And our assessments are merely performative artifacts. ABET processes do not actually improve student learning. They are outcomes-centered, not student-centered. And our collective inability to recognize the power dynamics of accreditation that we are living under results in us giving power over to accreditation, effectively abolishing much of what is valuable in engineering ethics education. So accreditation fosters feckless, inauthentic, and performative change rather than transformation of our classrooms, our students, and ourselves. Our participation in this system makes us puppeteers of accreditation. So then what are we going to do? Well, we must critically and reflexively consider the codes, oaths, and accreditation regimes that have so far formed the basis of engineering ethics education and reach beyond them to a space of moral imagination. empowering engineers to dream the world as it could be otherwise, and engage creative ethical action throughout the engineering profession to advance an aspirational social good. In our chapter, using our, and I'm quoting here, using our moral imagination, we wonder, what would engineering ethics education look like if it were truly accountable, if it were rooted in a diversity of experiences, realities, intersectionalities of identity and ways of knowing? Accreditation, our oaths and our codes might come in that case from the various publics we serve, rather than from a self-policing that reflects existing patriarchal hierarchies of knowledge. What would accreditation look like if it were locally situated with accountability to the land and its stewards? Or what would engineering look like without accreditation at all? Moving away from outcomes-based assessments towards those that are relational, process-driven, reflective, participatory, and liberatory may be far more appropriate for engineering ethics education. We have work yet to do in reckoning with what trauma engineers have wrought on this planet and in our communities, and exploring imaginaries that are knit from below the surface, from the silences, and from the interstices of our knowledge. So where would we begin with that? That was a long quote, by the way. That was the end of the quote. All of that is in the chapter. So where do we begin? Well, we start where we are. And in my case, I recently moved to the state of New Mexico, which is a place like no other. It is sometimes referred to as a thin place. Every morning I wake up in awe of the mountains, the blue sky, the quality of light. As a New York Times travel writer describes his experience of being in thin places, he says, "It does disorient. It confuses. We lose our bearings and find new ones, or not. Either way, we are jolted out of old ways of seeing the world." Here in Lausanne, we have some of the most beautiful walks in the world. I took one on Tuesday through vineyards overlooking a beautiful lake. Our sense of belonging to a place, what Nuevo Mexicanos call querencia, is a way to ground our moral imagination so our dreams can take root. So I'm married to a visual artist. Some of you met him last night at the dinner. A book recently entered our house. It's a beautiful book that is itself a work of art to hold in your hands. The book is by Rick Rubin, who's a record producer, founder of Def Jam Recordings. And his thoughts on the ontology of creativity are truly profound. This idea of the creative as midwife, bridging two worlds, turning ideas into reality, is what engineering ethics education is all about. It is akin to the Marxian notion of praxis. To quote, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. Thank you. Nice. This is the participatory part of the lecture, so get your phones ready for your speak up. So from here, we might ask ourselves and our students some questions. What could it mean to engineer as if the global south mattered? Or to engineer for climate justice? Those two might be related. Or what if we didn't engineer at all? So I want you to take a moment to think about what your what-ifs might be, and you can share them on Speak Up. And I realized I didn't bring my phone up here, so someone might want to help me, or someone else can read some out. Does someone want to volunteer to read out some intriguing what-ifs from the Speak Up? Ooh, here's one. What if the engineering profession could write a public apology to all beings who have been harmed by our actions through the centuries? What if we engineered as if we weren't saving the world? I like that one. All right. So you all can read these too. What if solar punk was a reality and not just an imaginary? Ooh, what if the money didn't decide? These are all good ones. Great. Oh, these are all coming in now. Woo. What is engineering without capitalism? That's a good question. Ponder that one. Yes, what if we co-design solutions instead of inventing problems? All right. I'm going to get into that, actually. So I'm going to share mine, which is, What if Bob Dylan wrote engineering initiation ceremonies instead of Rudyard Kipling? He might have some things to say that would put us in a more critical and reflexive place as we contemplate engineering ethics. All right, so engineering studies scholar Gary Downey has emphasized the importance of problem definition among engineers. Some of you are getting to that in your what-ifs. He's charged us not to accept others' definitions in a hired gun or given find kind of scenario. And right now, especially in this moment for artificial intelligence or for space commercialization, we see the futurists controlling the problem definition, focusing narrowly on technology, projecting privilege and arrogance. And we see correctives to disasters perceived in the mainstream and misframed as sudden or fast, when Scott Knowles and other STS disaster scholars would note that these are, in fact, slow disasters that are preventable if we could just open our minds. So who needs to be at the table empowered to give voice to the slow disasters unfolding in our midst? The long now of moral imagination can help us define better problems, incorporating historical, cultural, and social antecedents to life today. In addition to learning from past failures and anticipating the unanticipated, we can develop new critical problem framings for the long term. For example, Ben Pauley has pointed out that as we focused on fixing lead pipes in Flint, Michigan, we missed opportunities to address the underlying economic and racial injustice and related crises of governance that might actually prevent the next crisis in Flint. So how could engineering participate in defining better problems? Feminist philosophy gives us some generative places to launch moral imagination exercises. So for example, feminist STS persistently asks, whose engineering? Whose knowledges, whose ways of knowing count? How could indigenous knowledge be incorporated? How could we reckon with the colonial histories of engineering, for example? Questions of care have been proposed for a quarter century now in engineering education, dating back at least to Marina Pantazidou and Indira Nair's 1998 JEE article. Who is cared for? Who is cared about? Who is taken care of? How could it be otherwise? Or justice questions, as Caroline Bailey and others in the International Network of Engineering, Social Justice, and Peace have been asking for about 2 decades now. Who benefits? Who bears the cost? Who decides? Who has standing to be a moral agent? How can engineering be more accountable to others? As we pursue these questions and wade into community-based or community-led relationships, we must confront what Margaret Urban Walker calls moral remainders. The need to iterate, knowing that there are not perfect solutions, and there is real harm that must be accounted for in engineering. Real relationships where repair is needed. So this brings me to the limitations of cases and the work of Caroline Whitbeck, a feminist philosopher turned engineering ethicist who was early in critiquing cases as engineering ethics pedagogy some 30 years ago. Her critique of dilemmas and closed-ended case studies that put students in the role of a judge or worse, a non-expert, led to innovations where Whitbeck focused on empowering students as moral agents, on devising better cases which were more open-ended, and at times challenging to existing power dynamics in the profession. I commend her book to you. It has some very interesting cases that are outside the engineering ethics norm. Her shift was an invitation to moral imagination by treating engineering ethics as open-ended design rather than as problem solving, with an implicit recognition of Walker's moral remainders. What might all of this mean for our engineering ethics classrooms? How can we make space for moral imagination? I believe the more we stay in Rubin's creative space where ideas turn into action, the better chances we have to cultivate moral imagination for our students and for the world. Community-led learning is one way to keep ethics rooted in action. Critical approaches can help us see the structures and systems that we work within, and contemplative pedagogies can help us develop both embodied and affective aspects of our ethics capacities. Any and all of these approaches can be implemented within single courses or even parts of courses. And at the same time, I would say, we need to shift the structure of the engineering ethics curriculum beyond single course interventions and beyond the pragmatic but limited micro-module approach. We know moral development occurs over years. Engineering ethics must be taught over time to allow room for personal reflection and personal growth. We need engaging exercises so that our engineering faculty are approaching students directly, demonstrating that engineers care about ethics so that the hidden curriculum doesn't tell students engineers don't really do ethics, right? Real engineers don't do ethics. They see that every day that their engineering professor doesn't teach them ethics. So we need our faculty engaged. At the same time, we need engineering students to learn from experts in philosophy, both to build intellectual power in learning philosophy's approaches to knowledge and by developing respect for that expertise. The development of relationships also matters here, providing lifelong learning communities that our students might be able to draw upon over the course of their professional lives. In addition to the typical critical thinking and perspective-taking approaches we teach in engineering ethics, we need to develop students' moral imaginations and empower students to both understand engineering in social and policy contexts, and to navigate these contexts strategically in order to do the right thing. We would do well to shift our understanding of the profession so that engineers are positioned to offer a kind of ethical curation of socio-technical systems. We can prepare students for substantive and effective action in the world. We can help them develop empathy, listening, collaboration, power sharing, as well as the ability to challenge systems that do not afford deliberation, shared power, or attention to the knowledges, values, and views of particular groups. Our students need to develop cultural and epistemic humility in technical and moral matters, and make moral determinations from a position of engagement and locally situated definitions of public health, safety, and welfare. In 2018, Justin Hess and Grant Four conducted a systematic review of engineering ethics approaches, and I think it's a very interesting paper because it underscores our over-reliance on codes and cases, where simple awareness of ethics or ethical decision-making are emphasized over the development of moral courage or the development of commitment to action. We need to serve our students better by balancing our focus to empower moral courage and ethical commitment among engineers. Employing the creative arts can be a beneficial learning strategy for engineers who spend so much time in STEM courses. One example is that we used fiction to stimulate moral imagination in an engineering ethics class. I taught with Brent Jessica and Alice Polly at Purdue University a class on the topic of engineering and climate change. And we employed some speculative fiction short stories to engage students in thinking and feeling about possible climate futures. And of course, the critiques that those futures imply about our present reality. The openings created by these readings were profound, and especially the assignment we gave where they wrote their own speculative fiction about climate change. Engineering ethics education presents perennial challenges, and some of what I'm calling for here will not make things any easier. First, our students continue to be very focused on grades and credentials such that they lose sight of learning and growth. Asking them why in successive layers can help reveal their motivations for learning and for learning ethics in particular. I find my students in US contexts often enter with ethical instincts that hew closely to ethical egoism or some broadly utilitarian or other consequentialist perspectives. Breaking out of that frame can be difficult, especially if they are literally bought into the idea of loyalty to their employer or a hired gun frame. And introducing other frameworks can help them develop their moral imagination and begin to consider other perspectives. Current ethics training in our existing canon of engineering codes, oaths, cases, and ceremonies tends to devalue and dismiss voices that diverge from, challenge, or oppose the profession's status quo. Occasionally, we celebrate a whistleblower here or there, but we need to go further to teach empathy, listening, as well as an understanding and analysis of power. Resistance to power can be pragmatically difficult for students to undertake, even if they feel ethically called or bound to do so, because of economic circumstances or family responsibilities. So it can be helpful to employ our own empathy, listening, and power analysis to brainstorm with students as they become professional engineers what some preventive and creative approaches might look like as they navigate the real professional ethical realities of their work life. Teaching this pragmatic approach is particularly important at this moment in history with the rise of authoritarianism and weakening of democracies worldwide. There are resources we can draw on here, particularly, I would say, the German 1950 statement that I referenced earlier. Gary Downey's series illuminating the relationship of engineering to the establishment of nation states is pretty informative, and some older literature like Lauren Graham's The Ghost of the Executed Engineer or Ed Layton's The Revolt of the Engineers. Bringing one of these readings back onto our syllabi could open some crucial conversations in our time and place. Finally, students and engineering employees can and often do have an exaggerated sense of what can go wrong if they speak up. The recent deaths of two Boeing whistleblowers in the US and the cultures of intimidation that some employees have reported has not helped matters at all. And making sure that our students have opportunities to brainstorm those multiple approaches, including preventive approaches, emphasizing interpersonal strategies, can help. So in conclusion, we need to move beyond the current engineering ethics education regime if we expect to produce engineers who behave ethically. Codes, oaths, ceremonies, cases, and accreditation are all celebrated aspects of engineering ethics education, but each is limited in what it produces. We must move beyond these to encourage students to feel as much as they think about engineering ethics, opening their empathy, creativity, and moral imagination. Codes and cases, oaths, and even accreditation can be revised, and I would argue should be, but in doing so, we should not fool ourselves into thinking that we have the final perfect draft. As Foucault tells us, we cannot operate outside of power, and our efforts will always reflect our power relations, even as we must make attempts to resist or upend those power relations. All we can offer is our humble best take, building on what came before and hoping future generations will find something of value in what we've left behind. So perhaps we can find joy in turning imagination into reality, writing, rewriting, revising codes, studying and analyzing oaths, even inventing accreditation as it could be otherwise. Let's keep the consensus moving.